tonight I want to give a much more general talk, and I just want to get you acquainted with the work that's been done on the evolution of goodness and empathy and justice from an evolutionary perspective. So what I want to do is sort of tell it like a story in the history of science, a mystery story. And like all good mysteries, this revolves around some problem that needed to be solved. And that problem for evolutionary biologists was this. And it's a very strange problem. The problem is, why do we ever see anything be nice to anything else in nature? And if you think about just your basic biology classes, in all of them, when you were taught even just a little bit about evolution and natural selection, one thing you would have been told is that natural selection will favor whatever kinds of behavior gets organisms more things, more food, more resources, more mates. And yet, over and over again, we see altruistic and cooperative behaviors in nature. And by altruism, I mean something that an organism does to help others at a cost to itself. How in the world does this evolve? Ever since Darwin first introduced evolutionary biology, this is something that has been a riddle for evolutionary biologists. It seems like the exact opposite of what you would expect if natural selection favors behaviors that get you more stuff. Altruism is the opposite. It's doing things to help others at a cost to yourself. And so what I want to do today is start off by just giving you 2 or 3 videos that demonstrate altruism in the wild so that we're all on the same page when it comes to what kind of behavior we're talking about. Discuss a little bit of the history and how people have begun to solve this riddle. What could possibly ever favor these sorts of altruistic and cooperative behaviors? And then once we've done that, I want to extend the logic that we're going to use to other kinds of goodness. And so we'll look at empathy, and we'll look at maybe even the early stages of the evolution of morality in non-humans. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of altruism and cooperation we see in nature, let me walk you through a few of my favorite examples. If you were at the talk this afternoon, you saw this video. This is a ground squirrel studied out in the western part of the United States. And what's happened is some danger has appeared, some sort of hawk in the sky or some sort of animal hunting on the ground. And one or a few of the squirrels stands up on its hind legs and gives out that alarm call. And what other squirrels in the area do is they run for safety immediately. And after this alarm caller is finished, it runs for safety too. But there's all sorts of data that shows, and not surprisingly, that if there is something that wants to eat you, standing up and screaming at the top of your lungs in the middle of a field is a costly thing to do. And there's lots of data that demonstrate that if you hear that alarm call and you run for safety, you're better off than if you don't. So it's a classic example of altruism, something that is costly to the individual who does it, the alarm caller, but benefits others. One of the things about the evolutionary approach to altruism that's different from the way that, say, psychologists or anthropologists or sociologists might think about goodness and altruism is that the evolutionary definition doesn't say anything about intent. We're not saying that you have to intend to do something good. All we're saying is that we measure the costs and benefits. If something is costly to you and helps others, then that's altruism. And the interesting thing about that is that you don't need a nervous system to display altruism. Right? You don't need a brain to display altruism. You can get altruism in simple life forms. So this afternoon I spent a lot of time on my own work on that. Now I want to show you another classic example, probably the first one, of altruism in very simple life forms. So these are slime mold. Each one of them, you can see they're tiny. Each one of them is in the soil all over the place. And what they do is they move around and they look for things to eat. And at some point, when the slime mold run out of food in their area, they all come together and they form this right here. This is often referred to as the slug stage of their development. What you're looking at is anywhere from 5,000 to 500,000 of these individual cells that have come together to form that, and that thing moves around as if it was a multicellular creature. It responds to stimuli in the environment. It moves as if it was actually a creature made up of many, many cells. But in fact, it's just these cells that were independent. They were independently living organisms. They came together and they formed this slug stage. Now, where the real altruism here occurs is what happens next. At some point, the slug gets big enough that it starts the process of reproduction. And when reproduction occurs, you get these things that you're seeing here that are known as fruiting bodies. And a fruiting body is the reproductive stage of the slime mold. And what you've got is each one of these things coming up as a fruiting body. On the top in this capsule are the spores. That's the next generation of slime mold. The spores in the capsule are being lifted up by this stalk. Right? And the thing about reproduction in the slime mold is what you want to do is get up as high off of the soil as you can so that when the capsule at the top opens up, the spores can disperse as far as possible. So the higher up you can get, the better. And that's what the stalk does. It lifts it up so that if a tiny little invertebrate or even a drop of rain breaks open the capsule, the spores disperse really far. Now, the interesting thing is that the capsule and the spores are the reproductive units. But the stalk is made up of slime mold cells as well. Before they were in the stalk and slug stage, those were independently living free organisms. When they go and form a stalk, they never reproduce. All they do is provide this huge benefit to the spores up in the capsule stage. So the cells that form this stalk are, again, a classic example of individuals displaying altruism. The benefit they do is they help the spores get up high, which creates lots of dispersal. The cost is the ultimate cost. They never reproduce. All they do is form a ladder so that the other cells can get as high as possible. No nervous system, no brain, but a behavior that's costly to the individual and benefits others. Okay. One last example, and this one is in humans. Now, I could show you a million examples of altruism and cooperation in humans, and they would vary in terms of how extreme they are. So the most extreme things would be something like somebody jumping onto the train tracks to save the life of a little baby that wasn't their own. You know, they might risk their whole life just to save somebody else's child. But those are hard to study. And there are all kinds of nice studies that have been done on altruism. I picked one here that deals with altruism in really young children because I want you to see how early in human development we begin to display altruistic behaviors. So I'm going to show you a 1-minute video, but let me set it up for you so you know what's happening. So this was an experiment that was done at the one of the Max Planck Institutes in Germany. And basically what happened was the researcher advertised for mothers to bring in their really, really young children. I'm guessing they were about 2 years old, most of them. And they were told that they would be part of some experiment. Right? And all they're going to do is, you'll see in the corner, the mother and her little child right next to her. Okay? And the child is actually the subject of the experiment. And the mother herself doesn't know exactly what the experiment is about. The child has no idea what's going on, except that their mother brought them in this room and said they need to stay with, they need to be in this room for a little bit with them, and then they'll go home. Okay? And then the researcher who runs the experiment is going to walk in. Okay? Very, very tall guy, and you watch what happens. Okay, so they did this over and over again, and this is what they found. And they did all the controls that you'd want to do in a good experiment, right? So it's not just that like a noisy thing at the door gets the kid to walk over and do that. You have to have somebody who clearly has a problem that they can't seem to solve, and that's when this little kid goes over and does it. And that look at the end, where he looks up at the guy, says it all. He's basically looking up and saying, I'm not really sure why you couldn't do this, but this is how you open those doors, right? And now this is not an example. This is not an extreme example of altruism, right? It's not extremely costly for the little kid to come over there. When you look at it, you might think it's not really that costly at all. All he has to do is walk over and open the door. But think about it from the perspective of this guy. This giant monster walks into the room and starts banging up against things. And you walk away from the safety of right next to your mother and solve the problem for that guy who could probably eat you, you probably would think, if you're that little kid. And yet he goes over and he does it. And he's only 2 years old. This tendency to try and help others is something that we see in humans from a very, very young age. So let's try and figure out how we can explain the evolution of these kinds of behaviors. As I mentioned before, people have been debating this question ever since Darwin wrote The Origin of Species and published it in 1859. Now, I don't know how many of you have read The Origin of Species, but if you haven't, most scientists would tell you this is the single most important book written in the history of science. One of the things that I love most about The Origin of Species is, in addition to all of the breakthrough science, Darwin does something very interesting. At the end of almost all of his chapters, he has a whole section on the problems that he has with his own theory that he's just laid out in that chapter. And he just says, here's what I told you. Now, here are the problems I see. I'm not really sure if I have a solution for this one. Maybe this solves that. This one we have no idea about. Of all of the problems that he lays out in The Origin of Species, this is one that perhaps most of all drove him crazy, this altruism question. And for Darwin, the way he talked about it in many ways, but one of the ways he most discussed it was in the altruism that you see in social insects like honeybees and ants and wasps and that sort of thing. So we all know that if you get too close to the hive, the workers' bees will come out and they will sting you to defend the hive. Now, in honeybees, for example, and in other species as well, when a worker defends the hive by stinging you, when they pull back from stinging you, the stinger is ripped off their body and they die. Again, the single most costly thing that you could do as a honeybee. You give up your life to defend others at the hive. Darwin would write his friends that this problem was driving him literally half mad, was the way he described it. He couldn't figure out how on earth this sort of behavior would have been favored by his theory of natural selection, which seems to say, do everything to help yourself and nothing to help others, and yet here we get the exact opposite. In The Origin, he writes about it as a difficulty that at first seemed to be insuperable. He couldn't figure out how to solve it, and maybe fatal to the whole theory. Arguably, the most important theory ever developed in biology. And for Darwin, if he can't solve this, he's worried that the whole theory is going to fall apart. But finally, he comes up with a possible solution. And the solution came when he realized something very basic. Okay, so when honeybees or any insects like this defend the hive, they're not just defending any old group of bees in the area. Their hive is stock full of their relatives. Okay? And in particular, there's the queen, who is a little baby-making machine, who is going to pump out dozens or hundreds or perhaps even thousands of sisters and brothers of the workers who give up their lives. So when you protect the hive, you're protecting your relatives. Okay? And I won't get into the details of it, but social insects like this have a very strange genetics. Okay? We, as mammals, are diploids. We have 2 copies of every chromosome. Insects like this are what are called haplodiploids. That means that females have 2 copies of every chromosome, but males have 1. And the important part of that is that strange genetics makes sister workers extremely highly related to each other. So when they defend the nest, they're defending a queen who is a baby-making machine, pumping out brothers and sisters, and other workers who are very, very highly related to them. Now, this is 1859 when Darwin publishes the book. And so Mendel's experiment that would lead to the birth of the field of genetics was just close to being over, and certainly nobody knew about it in any detail at all. So the words that we have today to describe genes and genetics were not in Darwin's vocabulary. They were in nobody's vocabulary. But he understood something. So he knew that the reason that offspring look like their parents is there must be something that parents are passing down to their offspring that's making offspring look and act like their parents. That's something we would call genes. Darwin didn't have that word, but he thought there was something that he termed gemules that were essentially serve the same function. Okay? And then he said, here's one way you can solve the problem of the evolution of altruism. If you think about evolution and natural selection as a sort of spreadsheet where there are costs and benefits, right? Even though the worker who goes out and stings you to defend the hive is paying the ultimate cost and is dead, okay? They're gone. If by defending the hive, they make it so the queen can produce another 100 of their sisters by definition are likely to have the same genes, as we would say today, as they do. That's what it means that you're sisters. You have very, very similar genetic makeup. So you can save the equivalent of maybe hundreds of copies of genes that you have by saving your genetic relatives. You indirectly pass on the genes you have. You don't because you're dead, but your relatives do because you save them. And in particular, you save the queen, who's going to pump out all these little babies who are going to be genetically like you. So more copies of your genes get into the next generation, even if you give up your life. That was one of the ideas that Darwin came up with for solving this riddle. So the upshot of that is that we expect to see altruism especially common among genetic relatives. Now, one of the things that happened was that for a while people talked about this idea, and then it sort of disappeared, and then it reappeared again in the early 1960s when the sort of modern approach to studying evolution and behavior emerged. And in particular, this fellow here by the name of Bill Hamilton was the person who took Darwin's ideas and then some of the ideas that had been developed by a few, but not many others over the years, and he developed a mathematical model to help us explain when we expect to see altruism among family members, among genetic relatives. So I want to tell you about that development, and then we'll look at a test of it and other types of experiments on goodness and empathy and justice. So Hamilton is widely regarded as probably the most important evolutionary biologist of the 20th century. Many people talk about him as the Darwin of the 20th century. So it's worth just spending a minute because this is a fascinating character. He was a major character in one of the books that I wrote on the history of this topic. And he grew up about 2 kilometers away from Darwin's Down House, where Darwin did all of his work. And his mother would take him and his little brothers and sisters to Down House all the time and teach them when they were really young about evolution. And when I was researching this, I had the chance to go over and spend some time in the house that Hamilton grew up with, and I was talking with his sister. And his sister swears to me that when they were little kids, their mother used to read them The Origin of Species as a bedtime story. So I don't know if that's true, but she swears it. So this is someone who was sort of immersed in this kind of approach for a very, very long time. So he gets old enough and he does what good Brits do, and in this case he went to Cambridge, all right? And it was there that he became interested in studying the evolution of altruism and really started thinking about taking the ideas that Darwin had and developing them into a more formal model that allows for very specific predictions. He starts to think about that, but he doesn't really develop that idea until he goes to a very strange place. He does his PhD at the London School of Economics. It's important to mention that because basically, although my evolutionary biologist friends probably wouldn't like me saying this, essentially what we do in evolutionary biology is we steal models that economists make, and we put them and we look at them over evolutionary time. So we take them and we evolutionize them. So Hamilton learned the skills of economic cost-benefit analysis at the London School of Economics, and then he applied them to this biological question of when it is that we expect to see altruism among genetic relatives, among family members. And that was his dissertation work, probably the most cited pair of papers in the history of the study of evolution and behavior. And let me show you Hamilton's idea. The model can be boiled down to extremely, extremely simple form. So when he finished his dissertation, first he published these ideas in this 50-page paper in a journal called the Journal of Theoretical Biology, and it had dozens and dozens and dozens of impenetrable mathematical equations. But Hamilton did something brilliant, which was he was able to summarize all of the math into this simple, simple equation that anybody that had even a week of algebra would understand. So I want to walk you through this because it allows us to make some really specific predictions about altruism. So what Hamilton said to start with is you need to be able to measure 3 things, and then you can use my model to predict when you're going to see altruism. You need to measure the genetic relatedness among individuals. Okay? It's not enough to just know that they're genetic relatives. You have to be able to measure the exact genetic relatedness. Okay? Now, historically, even up through the time where Hamilton was working, the way that you did this was by hard work and constructing family trees. Okay, so if you were studying those ground squirrels we talked about, that would mean that every year you went out to the field and you marked your ground squirrels, you saw who mated with who, so you knew who the mother of the offspring was, maybe you know who the father was, you know who those offsprings, you know, whose brothers and sisters, you also know who their mother's sister was, so you know who their cousins were, and you construct family trees the way that we do. By the time Hamilton did his work, there were all sorts of tables that had been developed to say that if individuals are cousins or siblings or third cousins, you could look up their genetic relatedness on a table that had been developed. And genetic relatedness ran between 0 and 1, where siblings are at a value of 1/2. A random unrelated population would have a genetic relatedness of 0. And a 1 would be something like identical twins or clones. Okay. So once you had the data From this, you could find out exactly how related everybody in the population was. It would be a lot of work, but you could do it. Of course, nowadays, you can get estimates of that using various molecular genetic tools like DNA fingerprinting and so on. There are benefits to the quick way, there are costs, but you can do it. So you need to be able to get a number that represents genetic relatedness. Then you need to be able to measure the cost of the altruistic act. It's not enough anymore to say, for example, well, if you stand up on your hind legs and scream, it's costly. You need to be able to quantify that, to come up with a measure of it. Okay? And so, for example, in our ground squirrel case, if you're the one giving the alarm call, are you twice as likely to be taken by the predator? Are you 10 times as likely to be taken by the predator? Maybe you're only 5% more likely to be taken by the predator. You can measure the probability of surviving if you're the alarm caller or if you're not, and you can measure the cost. It's a lot of work, but you can do it. And the last thing that Hamilton says is you need to be able to measure the benefit associated with altruism. So again, think about our ground squirrels. It's not enough to say that once somebody gives an alarm call, you run for safety. We need to say how much of a benefit you received and measure it. So for example, one way to do that would be go to lots of groups of ground squirrels. Some of them will have a number of alarm callers in their group. Some of them may only have one alarm caller in the group. And some of them, by chance, will have no alarm callers. What's the probability of a random individual in one of those populations surviving? So if you're an individual who happens to be in a population with no alarm callers, what's your probability of survival over, say, a summer? If you're in a group with one of those alarm callers and you're not an alarm caller, what's your probability of survival? Is it higher than if you were in a group with none? And if you're in a group with 5, so that almost every time there's a predator around, somebody gives a call, what's your probability of surviving then? You would expect it to be higher. You can measure those things. If you can measure those 3 things, Hamilton says that we expect altruism to evolve when the genetic relatedness between individuals multiplied by the benefit that you get if you're helped is greater than the cost of altruism. And the logic here is really simple. Anytime there's a cost to a behavior, somehow or another, if natural selection is going to favor that behavior, there has to be benefits that make up for the cost, one way or another. In Hamilton's model, the benefits are the indirect benefits you get as an altruist by helping your genetic relatives. And that benefit is what they get, but you don't get the whole thing that they get. You get what they get multiplied by your genetic relatedness. And genetic relatedness is the probability that you and your relative have the same copy of the gene. So you take what they get and you discount it. You lower it by a little bit. And how much is how related you are to them. So if you're highly related to them, you're not decreasing it that much. If you're more distantly related to them, then you are decreasing it that much, a little bit more. When the genetic relatedness times the benefit to others is greater than the cost of altruism, then Hamilton says altruism evolves, because you've made up the cost indirectly by helping your relatives. This is in the literature referred to as Hamilton's rule, and in fact it's more powerful than what we just talked about, because there are many instances, there are many types of altruism that are like this. Now, not all altruism is going to be what I'm saying here, but some types of altruism work like this. The cost is usually paid a single time. So for example, you give that alarm call as a ground squirrel. But the benefit can be received by lots and lots of genetic relatives. So it's not going to be any more costly for me to give an alarm call that helps 5 of my genetic relatives than helps 10 of my genetic relatives. It's the same alarm call. Maybe it's a little louder, but that cost is trivial. And so with the same call, for some kinds of altruism, you can help lots and lots of your genetic relatives. So you pay the cost once for making the call. The benefit, the indirect benefit you get, is going to be a function of how many relatives you help. If you help one relative, then you get the genetic relatedness to that relative times how much they got helped. If you help 2 relatives, then you get this for each one of the relatives you help. And if you help 10 relatives, then you get it for all 10 relatives, the genetic relatedness times the benefit for every single one of them. You add them up. So the beauty of this equation is that you can make a number of really, really basic predictions. Okay, so first of all, just what I was talking about now, the more relatives you help, the more likely this side of the equation is going to be greater than that side of the equation, which means the more likely altruism is to evolve. So we can test the prediction that the more relatives you help, the more likely altruism is to evolve. Then we can test a number of other predictions. We can test the prediction that for any given relative, when their genetic relatedness is higher, altruism is more likely to evolve because that makes this side of the equation bigger. In any given case, when the benefit that somebody gets by being helped is greater, that makes this side of the equation greater. That means altruism is more likely to evolve. So increase the benefits, you predict altruism will be more likely. Increase the cost of being altruistic, and you increase this side of the equation, which means altruism is less likely to evolve. So you get 4 predictions. Help more relatives, get more altruism. Increase genetic relatedness, get more altruism. Increase benefit to others, get more altruism. Increase cost to others, to self, get less altruism. And people have tested this over and over and over again in the literature, hundreds of examples of it. And this little simple equation really, really holds up well over time. People have tested all the predictions we've talked about, and they've tested them in tons of different kinds of animals. And Hamilton's equation really, really works. Let me give you a more detailed description of one way that people have used this notion that relatedness is important. And I want to go into a little bit more detail on the ground squirrels, and this will be the last ground squirrel you'll see. So it's a really neat system. Okay, so what you've got are lots of groups of ground squirrels that are living out in some field, and they're all separate from each other. So if you go into the average ground squirrel population, and you just ask, what are groups made up of? Generally, you'll find that, I've got 2 different clickers here. Generally, you'll find that about 30% of the group is made up by adult females, and about 20% of the group is made up by adult males. Okay? And I'm going to focus on the adults right now, so that's all we're going to worry about. So about 30% are adult females, about 20% are adult males. You then see who's giving alarm calls. Almost 70% of the alarm calls are given by females. If sex didn't matter, if it didn't matter if you were male or female, then you would expect about 30% of those calls to be given by adult females, because that's about what proportion they make up of a group. Instead, that figure is twice as high. They're more than twice as likely to give an alarm call than expected by chance. Then look at the rotten, stinking males over here, the adult males. They make up 20% of the group. Maybe they give 2% of the alarm calls. All right? Why? This is where Hamilton's ideas come into play. So you need to know one more bit about ground squirrels to understand why you see that difference in the sexes giving alarm calls. In ground squirrels, when you get old enough to be reproductively active, what happens is males leave the groups that they're born in, and they go out and find a mate in some other group away from their group. What that means is that adult males, the only relatives they will have in their group are any pups that they produce, that they father. Only their children will be, the children will be their children will be their only relatives in that group, because they're going to a group made up of completely unrelated individuals to them. But of course, if they mate and they have kids, those kids will be their relatives. But that's the only relatives they'll have in that group. When females reach the age of sexual maturity, they stay in the group in which they were born. And then they mate with these males that are coming in. What that means is, like the males, any offspring they produce are going to be their genetic relatives. But unlike the males, they are going to be surrounded by their sisters, Right? They are going to be surrounded by any daughters that stay there. They are going to be surrounded perhaps by their mother. They are going to be surrounded by their female cousins. They're going to be surrounded by lots and lots of female genetic relatives because females stay in the group where they were born. So if you want to understand who gives the alarm call, what you do is you look at who is surrounded by genetic relatives. Females are. Who's not surrounded by genetic relatives? Males are. Who's giving the alarm calls? Females. Who's not giving the alarm calls? Males. There's a little bit more information that suggests how important the genetic relatedness is here. Every once in a while, something happens, like a natural disaster will happen, a fire or a flood or something like that, that will essentially wipe out the area where these squirrels live and make it unlivable. Then everybody who's there, who survived, will have to go and live in another group. Now, males typically do that anyway when they get to sexual maturity, but now mature females have to do it, which they normally don't do. Now they're moving into groups where they're going to only have their kids as their genetic relatives. Right? They're just going to be moving in like a normal male would. When that happens, their altruism dramatically drops. When they're no longer surrounded by their genetic relatives, their altruism drops. We know from other experiments that they use odor to determine if they're surrounded by their genetic relatives. They can sense when they move to these other groups that those other individuals don't smell like relatives, and that's when you see a plummeting in altruism. Now, evolutionary biologists are not silly enough to say that genetic relatedness and kinship is the only way to get altruism, because we know there are plenty of examples in nature where we see altruism between individuals who are not genetic relatives. There's a whole large literature on another way that you get the evolution of altruism, and that centers on this notion of the exchange of altruistic acts, reciprocity. You help somebody, and then when you need help later, they help you. And that will allow unrelated individuals to be altruistic and cooperative with each other. Because there, you're solving the same problem that Darwin had, and the way that kinship solved the problem was that you were indirectly helping copies of your own genes in your relatives. The way that reciprocity solves the problem of how do I make up for the cost of helping somebody, the way that reciprocity solves that is later on when you need the help, you get it. And there are a number of examples of the way that this works in nature. And I'm going to show you one of the most famous. All right? So this is going to focus on altruism in vampire bats. So here's a vampire bat, right? And vampire bats live in small groups, about 10 to 15, maybe 20 individuals. Not a lot of genetic relatedness in these groups. Now, it's all well and good to be able to fly as a mammal. But the downside of it is that it's extremely energetically expensive. It's really, really expensive to fly compared to other modes of transportation. And of course, for the vampire bats, their nutrition are blood meals. They hook on to domesticated animals like cattle, and they feed on blood. People who work on vampire bats have shown that if a vampire bat doesn't get a new blood meal about every 36 hours, it starves to death. And so what I want to show you is some work that's asked whether or not one way that these bats get around the problem that it's very easy to go 36 hours sometimes without finding a meal. How do they get around that problem using the exchange of altruistic acts? So I'm going to show you a video. It runs about a minute, and it's narrated by Sir David Attenborough. And it's a little hard to hear, so I'll repeat what he says, but I'll keep the volume on, and then we'll talk about this example.
She turns to her neighbour and licks her face repeatedly, begging for food. If she goes hungry for more than a day or two, she will die. But her friend regurgitates enough life-giving blood to keep her going until the following day.
Okay. Could you hear that at all? Okay, good. Okay. All right. So basically what's happened is there's a starving bat. She turns to one of the other bats and she licks that bat in a sort of stereotypical way. And in this case, what happened was the other bat, who had a nice blood meal in her gut, regurgitated some of that blood into the starving bat's mouth, and she survived. Now, that happens, but it doesn't happen all of the time. Sometimes a hungry bat will go over to a bat that's got a stomach full of blood, and it's very easy to know who that is because they look much, much fatter than individuals who haven't gotten a blood meal. Sometimes, if they're lucky, they lick the face of this bat and they get a meal. But most of the time, they don't. And people who studied this began to ask, why? What is it that helps explain when they get that meal and when they don't get that meal? And it turns out that the answer is that bats have favorite partners. And the favorite partners are individuals who helped you when you were starving. So if you want to know who's most likely to get a blood meal when they solicit one, when they lick another bat, and if they're starving, they lick another bat, if you want to know who's going to get a blood meal, the best way to know that is to know whether or not when the other bat was starving, did you give them a meal? And if you did, then the odds are much, much better that you're going to get one when you're starving. They keep track of who's helped them, and they exchange acts of goodness. And again, there are more examples of this sort of thing in nature, but I'm not going to get into those right now. I want to finish up by going through two more kinds of behavior. I'm just going to do one example of each of these. And what I want to do is kind of take this notion that one way you can understand something that we really care about, like cooperation and altruism and being good to others. Take this approach that we've used, which is essentially to think about it from the perspective of evolutionary biology, try to come up with a theory, then look and see if we can find examples in non-humans. And the power of this is that even if all you care about is human behavior, in a sense, you only have a sample size of one because there's only one species of humans. Maybe, 100,000 years ago you would have had a sample size of 4 or 5, but right now you have a sample size of 1. But if you can study these things in non-humans, then you can look for general patterns that emerge across lots of different species when you're studying altruism or whatever you're studying. So I want to extend this and try and understand the evolution of empathy. And when I say empathy, what I mean is this. Empathy generally means that you can put yourself into the psychological state of somebody else. You can feel what they're feeling. So when you help somebody, for example, who's in distress, if empathy is playing a role, what's happening is you can essentially feel the distress that they feel if you're empathetic. And in order to decrease the distress that you're feeling because you can feel what they feel, you help them. But you have to be able to put yourself into the state of another individual to feel what they're feeling, and then empathy kicks in, and you might help them. So I want to show you maybe the only really solid good example of this in non-humans. And it deals with empathy in rats. And it's this brilliant experiment. So here's the way it's set up. There's a pair of rats, and of course there are like 20 of these pairs that are being tested. But for every pair of rats, they've lived together for a couple of weeks before the experiment. So they know each other. They're not related to each other. They're always the same sex, so there's no mating stuff going on. They've just been living together for 2 weeks. Then one of them is randomly chosen to be stuck into this little plexiglass box right here, okay, that has a locked door. Okay. It could breathe and it's fine, but it's clearly in trouble. It's clearly in distress. In fact, it makes ultrasonic sounds that are distress calls to anybody else who's around. So they can barely move around. They're in distress. They make these ultrasonic calls that other rats can hear. The other rat, who was again randomly chosen which one was going to be which, the other rat is allowed to move around freely in this big square canister that they live. The door to this is locked. It cannot be opened from the inside, but it can be opened from the outside. It's a hard task to solve, but it's possible for the rat on the outside to open up the door and free this rat if it so chooses. It's not an easy thing to learn, but it's possible. But you can't open the door from the inside. So let me show you what happens when you do this, and then we'll walk through maybe what's going on here. Again, there's a video, and hopefully the sound will work well.
So we put a free rat, the rat with the black dot on his head, into an arena, and in the center is his cage mate trapped in a plexiglass restrainer. The door to the restrainer can only be opened from the outside by the free rat. Here you're seeing the first 5 minutes sped up on the first day of testing. Even though it takes quite a bit of rat courage to venture into the scary arena center, the free rat persists in moving to the center and trying to figure this restrainer thing out so he can help his cage mate. So now in this clip, the rats have been in this paradigm several times. This is the 5th day of testing. And we're viewing the session in real time, but after 25 minutes have elapsed. What you see is that the free rat is very focused on the door. You will see him open the door for the first time in a moment. What I want you to notice is that the free rat freezes. He freezes because the door falls over, and since it's the first time he's opened the door, he's surprised and he startles by freezing at the sound of the falling door. There he goes. Now, after a brief exploration of the strange land of the restrainer, the liberated rat runs around exploring the arena. Wherever the liberated rat goes, the free rat follows, jumping on and licking him. For about 5 to 10 minutes, this apparent celebration continues, with the free rat very active and always in close proximity to his liberated cage mate.
Okay, so I don't know if they're celebrating, but I do know that they did this over and over again, and this is what happened. The free rat kept, after a while, it's a hard task to solve, but after a while they figured out how to open the door, and the free rat did it. What's more, they put them together day after day, and if you figured out how to open up the door on day 1, the next day your buddy was back inside and you open the door again, but much faster now that you know how to do it. And they did it day after day after day, and this is what their general pattern was. Right, so this is kind of consistent with the notion that you're helping others because you can sense the distress that they're in. But this is the kind of experiment that gives people who study animal behavior nightmares, because there are so many other things that can be going on here that aren't empathy. So let me tell you the brilliant follow-ups that these people did to this experiment. Okay, so first thing they did was they ran the experiment all over again, except after 2 rats had lived together for 2 weeks, they took one and they randomly chose it to be the free rat, right? But they didn't put any other rat. It was just this box, the plexiglass box was here, and there was no rat in it, but the door was locked. Now, what they said was, you know, we know that rats like to do things. They get bored when they're in the same box for very long periods of time. Maybe all that was going on here was that at least trying to open the door was something to do as a rat. And maybe they would just open the door even if there was nothing in there, because it's something to do in this big box that there's nothing else to do in. So if you run the experiment with no rat in there, the free rat is not interested in the door, and they don't open the door, ever. Then they ran the experiment again, same setup, but the free rat was out here, and inside was a model rat, like a rat that looked. It was a stuffed toy rat that looked like a rat, right? But it didn't make any distress calls because it wasn't a real rat. You put that rat in, a fake rat in there, but one that looks like a real rat, and the free rat isn't interested in the door and doesn't open up the door. So no distress calls, no attempt to open the door. Then they ran another experiment, and they said, the other thing that we know about rats is, believe it or not, there have been dozens and dozens of studies on play behavior in rats. And we know rats like to play with each other. All right? So here's a possibility. Maybe this rat just wants somebody to play with. Maybe he doesn't care, he or she could care less that this other rat is in distress. They don't care. All they want is to open the door so they can have somebody to play with. It doesn't matter that they're helping someone who's in distress. They don't care. Maybe that's what they wanted to do. And then it wouldn't be empathy. So what they did was they ran the same experiment again. Okay, and they waited until the time when the free rat finally opened up the door and got its buddy out. Right? Then, they would put them back together the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Every time after the first time the rat was freed, what would happen would be the investigator would go in, and as soon as the door was opened by the free rat, and this rat came out, the investigator would go in, take out the rat that had just gotten out of here, and put it someplace else. And the next day, they would put these rats together, and when this rat opened up the door, they would immediately take this rat out and put it someplace else. Now, these are smart rats. They figured out how to open up a very tricky door. They certainly have learned this. If I open door, this comes in and takes that out, and I don't have anybody to play with. Nonetheless, day after day after day, they keep opening up the door. So it's even after they've learned they will not have somebody to interact with, they still free the other rat. Then they ran one more, and I just have to tell you this because this is one of my favorite little experiments. This time what they did was they had the same setup as here, and then there's another little plexiglass box like this. Inside that other plexiglass box with a locked door are little bits of chocolate. And rats love chocolate. And they wanted to know, what would the free rat do? The rat on the outside here. What would the free rat do? Now, if it was a respectable, selfish rat, what it should do is go over, after it's figured out how to open a door, it should open up the door to the chocolate, eat the chocolate, and then maybe it should open up the door and free its buddy. But it certainly shouldn't do anything like give the food or help the other rat get food. What do the rats do? In general, the pattern goes like this. When they figure out how to open the door, they open the door to the other rat's cage. Then they go over and they open the door to the chocolate, and then the two rats share the chocolate. Doesn't that make you feel good? It makes me feel good that they do that. But the point is that you can run these sorts of alternative experiments, that you can get away from the danger of talking about things that seem to be so human, empathy, and implying that non-humans do it. That's a very, very dangerous thing. You have to be able to do these kinds of follow-up experiments to really rule out alternatives. This is the only good example I know of empathy in non-humans. But I should say, I doubt there are more than a handful of other experiments that have ever been run on empathy in non-humans. So it's not as if we consistently don't find it. We just haven't been looking for it.
We only have chocolate and mice.
That's right. That's what. Right. And now people, I think, are thinking about about this in other species. Now let me end, and I promise five more minutes, but I guarantee you'll be happy you stay for this last video. I want to talk about, again, extending this logic, now past goodness and empathy, and now onto morality and questions of justice and injustice. So this is, again, a very tricky thing to study in non-humans. But in humans, one thing that we know from endless studies is almost universally, people get very angry when they detect injustice. And by injustice, at the most general level, what I mean is that in a just system, you get the same work for the same pay. Right? So one of the reasons people in the US, for example, are so upset about differences between wages for men and women is it looks as if women get 70 cents for every dollar that men get for the same job. And that is fundamentally unfair. The same action should lead to the same reward. And we know people get furious when that's not the case. The question is whether there's evidence in non-humans that they respond to injustice as well, and that they respond in a way that might help us indeed understand the evolution of the response to injustice, because we're going to look at it in primates, our closest relatives. All right. So I'm going to tell you an experiment that was done by Frans de Waal and Sarah Brosnan. And you're looking at Sarah right here, and this is a very, very popular experiment. You can see it has more than 2 million hits on YouTube. But it's a serious science experiment. They just did some nice video work on it. Okay, so here's the setup, and then I'll let you see the video. And Frans de Waal will, again, say some of the stuff I said, but I just want to make sure you get the setup. There are 2 capuchin monkeys, okay? And they're separated by this mesh here. So you can see each other and touch each other and smell each other and everything. All right. And Sarah is out here. And Sarah has done something, well, the capuchins have done something very smart. They have let Sarah train them in a way that they have learned the following. Okay? They've learned that if they pick up a stone, a little rock, inside their cage, and they hand it to Sarah, Sarah will hand them a piece of food. And that alone is quite interesting, but it's not the key to this experiment. But they've learned, pick up the stone, hand it to Sarah, and you get a piece of food. And they learned that pretty quick. Now, Sarah has 2 kinds of food. You can see one of them, and you'll see the other one in the video. This is a little thing of cucumbers, and over here is a little thing of grapes. Now, capuchins like both cucumbers and grapes. If you hand a capuchin a grape, they will eat it. If you hand a capuchin a cucumber, they will eat it. But they like grapes more than they like cucumbers because there's a lot of sugar in grapes. So they prefer grapes to cucumbers. If you give them the choice, they will take grapes over cucumbers. Okay? So I'm going to say it again because when you watch the video, remember grapes are more valuable to a capuchin than cucumbers are. And watch what happens.
The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. Yeah. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. Okay. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it.
She's fine.
The other one needs to give a rock to us.
She does.
And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now.
Yeah, she's banging it. Maybe there's something wrong with the rock.
And she gets cucumber again.
And there you go. So, all right. And again.
This is basically the.
And again, that's Frans de Waal. And again, like the rat thing, this is just not one little strange thing that happened that they made a video of. This is consistently what happened. And think about it for a minute, because I mean, it's a great video. It makes me laugh. I've seen it 100 times, and it makes me laugh every time. But think about it more deeply for a second. This is really quite amazing. Because there have been hundreds, arguably more, experiments that deal with giving primates food, period. And one thing that's pretty clear is you give a primate a piece of food that it likes, and you will never see that piece of food again. It will eat it, almost universally. But here, these capuchins have basically told us the following, that a cucumber does not have an absolute value. It has a relative value, right? If somebody gives me a cucumber, that's fine. But if I do a task and I get a cucumber and somebody else does the task and they get better pay, the grape, that is fundamentally unfair. So unfair that rather than eat that cucumber, they throw it back at Sarah. Now, they didn't always throw it back at her, but they very rarely ate it, okay? And so here we see again, I don't know if you would want to call it morality per se, but it's the rudiments, it's the start of a moral system. It's the ability to gauge the relative value of something in relation to what somebody else gets, to respond to it. I mean, it's not just that they threw that piece back, right? It's that capuchin is clearly totally upset. I mean, it's banging down on the ground, it's shaking the cage, it's really upset. It seems to be acting in a way that suggests that it sensed what we would call unfairness. Now, there are very few experiments like this, right? this experiment has spurred a few others, but there aren't a lot of them. So I guess what I want to do just to wrap up here is say that since Darwin first posed these problems about how goodness has evolved, we've made a tremendous amount of progress. We now have a theory-based predictions. We now have experimental tests. We now have been able to extend it out to understanding things like empathy and maybe the roots of the response to injustice. At the same time, there's a lot that we don't know yet, right? I would say that, what the kind of things we're looking at here explains a good chunk of what we see in the natural world, but not all of it. There's plenty of examples of what we might call altruism or cooperation that don't fit in to any of the explanations that we've given here. There's a long way to go, and there's a long way to go to understand how to extend these kinds of studies to help us better understand human cooperation. But we're on the way, because the way is to develop theory, to develop very specific predictions, to test those predictions, to rule out alternative hypotheses. And if you're clever and you think about the problem right, you can do the kind of experiments that I've been showing you here. And I hope that people will keep doing them. I know they will. So, and I appreciate you coming out on a cold, rainy night to hear this. And I'm happy to take as many questions as you like. Thanks a lot. Thank you.